I never thought I'd be the guy who stands up in the middle of a dinner party and says 3 words out loud. This wedding's over, but that night when I heard them laughing about my mom, the woman who passed away after 3 brutal years of fighting cancer, I knew I couldn't just sit there and smile. Jack Avery's dad had the mic. He was telling one of his funny memories about my mother. He called her the type who just had to insert herself into everything even when no one asked. People laughed, polite chuckles, but in my ears it sounded like glass cracking under pressure, sharp and hollow. Avery laughed too, just a small laugh like it was charming. She didn't look at me, didn't notice how tight my fists were, how I was trying to stay still. My mom, Ruth Monroe, wasn't someone who craved attention. She just helped quietly, fully, without expecting anything back. She helped Avery's family when they were struggling, helped save their restaurant, helped with their son's tuition, and none of them ever really thanked her. But now here they were, turning her memory into a joke at a dinner that was supposed to celebrate love. So I stood up. I didn't slam anything. I didn't raise my voice. I just said I can't go through with marrying into a family that disrespects my mother like this. And I walked away. Some people will say I ruined a beautiful evening, but the only thing that felt wrong to me was how easily they forgot who she was. Have you ever been in that kind of moment where you had to choose between someone you love and someone who loved you unconditionally your whole life? What would you have done? Stayed and swallowed the pain, or walked away even if it hurt like hell? I want to hear your story. And if you've ever stood up for someone who wasn't there to defend themselves, drop a 1 in the comments. My name is Caleb Monroe. I'm 33 years old, and I've spent most of my life in Ashburn, Illinois, a place that isn't fancy, but it's home. It's the kind of town where the gas station clerk knows your dog's name and the neighbors bring over soup when someone's sick. I was raised by my mother, Ruth Monroe. Just the 2 of us. My dad died when I was 10. Heart attack sudden. I remember the silence that settled in our house afterward. Not the heavy, unbearable kind, but quiet, steady. Day. She wasn't loud, she didn't lecture. She taught through action, through the way she gave. We didn't have much. No vacations, no new cars, no expensive clothes. But there was food and books and warmth. When I got older and started working in home repair and systems, I offered to help pay bills. She'd always wave me off with a tired smile and say, "You just be a man I can be proud of. That's more than enough." She never remarried, never even dated as far as I know. She poured everything into me and the people around her. Looking back, I think I underestimated just how much weight she carried alone. When cancer came, it came hard. 3 years, chemo, radiation, hair falling out in handfuls. Still, she kept showing up to work until her legs gave out. I watched the strongest person I knew shrink physically and otherwise, and yet she never once complained. Not once. She died on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was holding her hand. And when she left, it felt like a whole part of me left with her. I spent months after that in a kind of fog. I still worked, still paid bills, but nothing felt alive. Then I met Avery. It was at a summer cookout. A friend from high school had invited me. I almost didn't go, but there she was standing near the grill, laughing with a glass of lemonade in her hand, wearing this sundress that made her look like she belonged in a magazine. She had presence. Not just beauty, though, she had that in spades, but a kind of polish. I wasn't used to confident sharp, like she'd grown up knowing she belonged in the spotlight. We talked for an hour straight that first day. She asked about Ashbourne, like it was a foreign country. I told her about the old library, the church fish fries, and how the street lamps on Main flickered every time it rained. She laughed and said, "Sounds like something out of a movie." We started dating not long after. Coffee turned into dinners. Phone calls turned into weekend trips. She made me feel like I wasn't just the local guy with a tool belt. She made me feel seen, and for a while, it was good. Real good. The first time I met her parents, Vincent and Margot Caldwell, was a lesson in contrast. They lived in a 3-story home with a black iron gate and a wine fridge that cost more than my truck. Margot wore a pearl necklace to dinner like it was casual. Vincent greeted me like he was interviewing for a business deal. He asked me what I did. I told him I worked in residential systems and ran my own small home renovation business. He smiled thinly. "Well," he said, "as long as you're not afraid to get your hands dirty." Margot didn't say much, just a raised eyebrow here and there, a glance at my shoes. Avery later told me, "Don't worry, they just take time." So I gave them time. I didn't grow up expecting approval from people like them. I figured if I treated Avery right, they'd eventually see me the way she did, but they never did. There were always little comments, always slightly veiled, always dressed up in politeness. Margot once said, "It's refreshing how grounded you are." Caleb, so many men in your position try too hard. Vincent liked to joke that I brought blue-collar energy into the room. I smiled, laughed, played along. Because I loved Avery and Avery, she never pushed back, never corrected them. But she'd squeeze my hand under the table and whisper later, "They don't mean anything by it," so I let it slide. Even when she started acting different, she wrinkled her nose when I talked about Ashbourne. She rolled her eyes when I suggested we get married at my hometown church. She called my ideas sweet and simple, like that was a compliment. But she still visited Mom's grave with me, still kissed my forehead when I looked tired. So I thought maybe this was just the price of blending two worlds. When I proposed, it was simple. I didn't rent a hot air balloon or hire a photographer. Just us on the porch swing, watching the sunset. I handed her the ring, and she said yes, through tears. That night, I remember thinking, this is it. This is my person. But looking back now, I think she cried because the moment was quiet, not because it was us. The cracks were already there, I just chose not to see them. Love makes you do that sometimes. It makes you hope longer than you should. It makes you stay quiet just to keep the peace. But peace built on silence never lasts. And mine was about to break wide open, I think. The first time I really felt it like deep in my gut was when Margot said, "Why don't we just handle the guest list, Caleb?" These things can get overwhelming. It wasn't a shout, wasn't even rude. Just one of those sentences that lands soft, but slices deep. We were sitting at their kitchen island, a smooth slab of imported marble that probably cost more than my first apartment. Avery was flipping through bridal magazines. I had my notebook open trying to offer a list of old friends I wanted to invite from Ashbourne. Margot didn't even look up, just waved her hand gently in my direction and said it like she was offering me relief. Like I should be grateful they were willing to take it off my plate. I looked over at Avery, waiting for her to say something, anything. She didn't, just turn the page. That was the first real crack I couldn't ignore. From there, it just kept going. Vincent loved to joke around me, always just enough of a smile to make it seem harmless. But his words were sharp. Make sure your family doesn't feel too out of place at the venue. We don't want anyone mistaking the crystal for plastic. Or, Margot and I were nervous at first, but you've grown on us like mold, slow and steady. Once when we were finalizing flower arrangements, I suggested something simple. Wildflowers, maybe even some from the fields near Ashbourne. Margot scoffed. "Oh no, darling, this isn't a barn wedding," I wanted to say. What if it was, but I didn't. I just nodded and tucked my hands into my pockets. It was easier not to fight, I'd tell myself. This isn't about pride. Just let them feel in control. It'll be over soon, but it didn't feel over. It felt like every week, another little piece of me was being sanded down. Even with Avery, things were changing. She used to ask me about work. Used to listen when I talked about the houses. I fixed the clients. I liked the days that went well. Now she just said things like, "You should really think about expanding. Maybe try more upscale neighborhoods." She started calling my suggestions cute. She started choosing her mother's opinions over mine, always softly, always with that smile. Once we were discussing the ceremony, I mentioned adding a small tribute to my mom in the program. Just a paragraph. A candle, maybe, something. Avery paused. "Wouldn't that make people sad? I mean, weddings are supposed to feel light." I stared at her. "It's not about making people sad. It's about honoring her." She looked down at her phone. "Let's just think about it later," but we never did. And there was this one night I still think about it more than I should. We were having dinner at their house. I'd come straight from work, still had paint on my hands from a renovation job. Margot raised an eyebrow the moment I walked in. "Long day," she said, handing me a cloth napkin, like she didn't want me touching anything. "Yeah," I said. Client changed the backsplash layout halfway through. Had to redo a whole section, Vincent chuckled. "That's why you hire people to do those things for you," I smiled. "Some of us are the people others hire." He didn't laugh, neither did Avery. She just shifted the wine glass on the table and said, "Anyway, about the rehearsal dinner." That was the moment I realized I was outnumbered. Not by people, by perspective. They saw the world like a ladder. Climb high, stay clean. Don't look back. I was built in the dirt. Raised to get my hands dirty to show up and fix what's broken, even if no one thanked me for it. That difference wasn't cute anymore. It wasn't a quirk to laugh about over wine. It was a wedge. And when they offered to host the rehearsal dinner at their flagship restaurant downtown, I didn't object. Maybe deep down, I still thought this was salvageable. Maybe I thought one grand gesture might balance out all the little insults. But then Margot said something that should have stopped me cold. We've already started planning the menu. It's going to be elegant, nothing too Midwestern. I blinked. What's that supposed to mean? She smiled. You know, no casseroles, no meatloaf, just refinement. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. That night on the drive home, I said to Avery, "Do you ever feel like your parents look down on where I come from?" She was silent for a second too long. Then she said, "They just want what's best for us, that's all." "But what if what's best to them is never going to include me?" I asked. She didn't answer, just stared out the passenger window and whispered, "You're overthinking." And that right there was when I realized something had changed in her too. She didn't defend me anymore. She didn't see me anymore. Or maybe she never did. Maybe I just wanted so badly to be seen that I imagined it. But even then, I didn't walk away. Because love teaches you to hold on too long. To stay just one more conversation, one more dinner, one more humiliating shrug of the shoulder, hoping the people who hurt you might one day realize what they're doing. The thing is, they knew, they just didn't care. And I was starting to care more than ever, because the closer we got to the wedding, the more I realized something no one ever tells you. You're not just marrying the person, you're marrying their world. And their world was swallowing mine whole. They called it a rehearsal dinner, but it felt more like a corporate showcase. From the moment I walked into Velvet Fig downtown, I could tell this night wasn't about Avery and me. It was about them. Vincent was already shaking hands like a congressman. Margot was flitting between tables with a practiced smile, whispering things to the waitstaff, straightening candles that didn't need straightening. I glanced around the room. 3 people from my side, my dad, my sister, and my childhood best friend. That was it. The other 60 chairs, filled with Caldwell cousins, business partners, wine distributors, and people I'd never met, but who knew the exact square footage of Avery's childhood home. I pulled Avery aside. "Where's the rest of my family? My uncle, my co-workers. You said they RSVP'd. She didn't even look at me, just said. There were too many names. My mom said the space was tight. I stared at her. "It's their restaurant," she shrugged. "Caleb. It's just one night. Don't make it a thing. Don't make it a thing." She'd been saying that a lot lately. I nodded and went back to my table, sat between my dad and sister, both of whom looked like they were trying very hard not to say what they were thinking. The food was good, of course it was. There were 5 courses, tiny plates, fancy names, stuff my mom would have called pretty, but empty. I barely tasted any of it. Then came the speeches. Vincent stood first, tapped a spoon against his glass with theatrical flair. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight as we prepare to welcome Caleb into the Caldwell family." The word welcome already made my chest tighten. He went on talking about Avery, how driven she was, how brilliant, how they knew from a young age that she was meant for something elevated. "She's always had great instincts," Vincent said, "and we're confident those instincts guided her to Caleb, a man with practical strengths." There was polite laughter. My sister whispered, "Did he just call you a hammer?" Vincent kept going. "Now Avery may be marrying into a different background than we envisioned, but love is full of surprises, right?" He winked another round of awkward laughter. I felt my jaw tighten. My father was gripping his fork like it might bend. Then Margot took the mic. She started off like she was giving a toast at a charity gala. She thanked the chef, the florist, the valet, before even mentioning me. Then she turned to me and smiled. "Caleb, dear, you've certainly taught us patience, pause, laughter, and a little humility. We never imagined Avery would find someone so grounded." Another pause. "But we've learned to appreciate a simpler outlook on life." She said it like she was congratulating herself. Then it happened. Vincent stood again, lifted his glass. "Before we end tonight, I want to acknowledge someone who's no longer with us, but who clearly shaped Caleb in many ways. His mother, Ruth." I sat up straighter. For half a second, I thought finally, a moment of grace. She was One of a kind, Vincent said. Always had an opinion, always ready to jump in. I remember how she used to offer help even when no one asked for it, Margot added, laughing. Oh yes, she insisted on helping. That woman didn't know how to stay in the background. They were smiling. People chuckled. I looked at Avery. She was smiling too. That's when it broke. I felt my throat close. My palms go cold, and my heart do that thing where it skips, not in love, but in fury. They were mocking her. My mom, the woman who co-signed their restaurant's first loan, who paid for their son's last semester of college, who drove an hour every weekend to babysit so they could keep the business afloat. And now in front of 60 guests they were painting her as some meddling burden, like her kindness had been a flaw. I stood up, the chair scraped back with a harsh screech. The room went quiet. Vincent paused mid-toast, blinking at me. I didn't yell, didn't raise my voice. I walked to the front of the room, took the mic from Margot's surprised hands, and looked at everyone. This wedding, I said, is off. Gasps. Silence. One person coughed. I looked at Vincent. You think it's funny to mock the woman who saved your business, who paid for your son's education when your accounts were in the red. He stiffened. Now hold on, I turned to Margot. And you? You thanked the valet before you mentioned me. Then you thanked me by calling my life simple, like that's a punchline. My voice cracked, but I kept going. And you? I said, facing Avery. You didn't say a word. You didn't flinch when they turned my mom into a joke. You laughed. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. I nodded. Then that's it, I handed the mic back. Walked down the aisle of white-clothed tables, past stares and whispers. My dad stood immediately, my sister followed. My best friend threw down his napkin like a judge handing out a sentence. We left. No apologies, no explanations. Just the echo of my mom's name twisted into something it never was ringing in my ears, and the sound of my own footsteps, walking away from a world I never really belonged to. The air outside hit me like a slap. Cold, still, almost too quiet. I stood on the curb for a few seconds, just breathing. My dad put a hand on my shoulder. My sister was pacing furious. My best friend lit a cigarette and didn't even offer one. He knew I'd stopped smoking years ago. Are you okay? My dad asked. I wasn't. I nodded anyway. We didn't say much on the drive home, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of everything you wish you could say, but know it's too late for. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my dress shoes. The city lights through the window made everything look softer than it really was. For a moment, I thought it was over, but it wasn't, because the more I sat there, the more one thing kept gnawing at me. They were going to twist it. They were going to go home, pour another glass of wine, and say I overreacted. That I was too emotional, that poor Avery had been humiliated by a man who couldn't handle a joke. And worse, people would believe them, because they were rich, polished, respected. And I had just walked out of my own wedding dinner. I stared at the floor, fists tightening. No, I wasn't going to let them rewrite the truth. This wasn't just about what they said. It was about what I had allowed, about how long I had let them disrespect the woman who raised me, about how much I had swallowed for the sake of peace. And I wasn't going to end this story with silence. So I stood up, changed out of my shirt, put on a clean one, looked in the mirror. Then I turned back to my dad. I need to go back, I said. He didn't even flinch, just nodded once. Want us with you? I shook my head. No, not this time. The restaurant was still lit when I got there. I could see silhouettes through the tall windows. People chatting, finishing dessert, pretending everything was fine. I pushed open the doors and stepped inside. Everything went quiet again, the same way it had when I stood up earlier, like someone had pressed pause. Vincent was still seated sipping his wine. Margot was adjusting a centerpiece. Avery stood near the back, talking to a cousin or pretending to. Someone gasped. Another whisper rippled through the room. I didn't stop walking. I went straight to the front, to the same spot where they had humiliated my mother. I didn't touch the mic this time. I didn't need amplification. Excuse me, I said loud and clear. Every head turned. I looked at them. All I know. Most of you came here tonight expecting celebration. A night of toasts, wine, pretty speeches. And I'm sorry it turned out differently. I took a breath. But I'm not sorry for what I said. Or what I did. Avery took a step forward. Caleb, maybe this isn't. No, I said gently, it is. I turned to face the room again. This isn't just about tonight. It's about the kind of family I was about to marry into. A family that mocks kindness, that confuses generosity with weakness, that thinks money is a free pass for cruelty. Vincent stood. All right, that's enough. I held up a hand. I stayed silent for too long. When Margot rolled her eyes at my suggestions. When you joked about my job. When you said my life was simple, like that was something to pity. Margot looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. And when you took my mother, Ruth Monroe, and turned her into a joke, that's when I realized I couldn't marry into this. I turned to Avery. You didn't stand up for me, not once. Not even when you saw what they were doing. She was crying now, but I wasn't moved by it, not anymore. Caleb? I didn't know what they'd say, but you knew who they were, I said. And you laughed anyway. I paused. Let the silence hang. Tonight I walked out because I couldn't listen to one more insult in a room full of people pretending it was okay. And I came back, I said, because I want every single person in this room to understand. I'm not angry. I'm done. This wedding is over. Officially, publicly, and permanently. A few people gasped. A woman near the back actually clapped once before catching herself. Vincent sneered. You're making a scene, son. I looked at him. Calm, clear. No, Vincent. You made a scene. I'm just making it honest. Then I nodded to no one in particular. To the night, to my mother maybe. And I walked out for the last time. No regrets. Just the sound of my own footsteps. Solid, certain. I thought walking out of that restaurant would be the end. I thought the hardest part was done. But endings. Real endings aren't always that clean. The next morning my phone lit up with over 70 notifications. Messages missed, calls, voicemails. Some from Avery, some from numbers I didn't even recognize. I didn't open any of them. Not at first. I just sat there on the couch holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the framed photo of my mom by the windowsill. She was laughing in that picture, caught mid-sentence. Wind blowing her hair slightly sideways, I whispered, I think I did the right thing. But even as I said it, something in me still burned. Not guilt, something else. A few hours later, Avery came by. She looked like she hadn't slept, still wearing the same dress from the night before. Eyes red, hands shaking. Can we talk? She said. I didn't open the door all the way. Just leaned against the frame. There's nothing left to talk about. Please, she said. I didn't know they'd go that far. I was just trying to keep the peace. I thought if I laughed it would take the tension out. I stared at her. You laughed at my mother. She flinched. I made a mistake, she whispered. You didn't make one mistake, Avery, I said quietly. You made 100 little choices, to stay silent, to smile through things you should have stopped, to let me shrink so you could fit. She was crying now. Real tears. I didn't doubt that. But I'd seen her cry before, and I knew tears weren't always about regret. Sometimes they were just about not getting your way. She left a small box on the porch, said it was the engagement ring, said I deserved to have it back. I didn't touch it. That night I opened my mom's keepsake box. It was an old wooden case. Simple inside were small things she'd left for me. Notes, her clinic ID badge, the dried flower I gave her in 7th grade, and the locket, the one that had been passed down through 4 generations of Monroe women, silver oval with a photo of my grandmother inside. The one she said I'd know when it was time to give to someone who deserved it. Only now, it was gone. I stared at the empty indentation where it had sat for years. Panic rose slow and thick. I tore through the box. Pulled out drawers, checked under the bed inside, old envelopes between books. Nothing. And then I remembered Avery had been inside my apartment just once. A few days before the dinner, when she came to return a scarf she borrowed. She asked to use the bathroom, and now the locket was gone. I texted her. Did you take the locket from Mom's box? She replied 5 minutes later. What are you talking about? I didn't even respond. I called her. She picked up, her voice was thin. I didn't think you'd notice so fast. I went still. So you did take it. I didn't take it. She said I borrowed it. I don't know. I wanted to keep a piece of her. To feel close to you, Avery, I said, trying to stay calm. That locket is over 100 years old. It belonged to my mother. You took it without asking. You didn't even tell me. She hesitated. I was going to give it back. Where is it? She paused again. At my parents' house, I thought it'd be safer there. That was it. That was the final crack. I didn't yell, I didn't curse. I just said, I'm coming to get it. Then I hung up. Their house looked the same as it always had. Tall, spotless gold. The kind of place where no one walks barefoot and every candle is decorative. Margot opened the door. She wore pearls again. I never knew if she actually liked them or if they were just armor. Caleb, she said. Frowning, this isn't a good time. I didn't flinch. Avery took something from me. I'm here to get it back. She stepped aside slowly. Avery came down the stairs holding the locket in her hand. No box, no cloth, just dangling between her fingers like a cheap trinket. My breath caught when I saw it. She held it out. Here I took it, opened it, checked the inside, the clasp, the tiny hinge. It was still intact, still hers, still mine. Then I looked at Avery. You crossed a line, I know, she whispered. No, I said, you don't. That locket wasn't just jewelry. It was trust legacy, and you took it like it was nothing. I just wanted a part of you, she said. Something real. Something that didn't hate me. My jaw clenched. You don't get to take from people and call it love. I turned to leave. Caleb, she said, desperate. Please, I made a mistake. I didn't turn back. I didn't owe her comfort. I walked out, stepped onto the Caldwell porch one last time, and as the door shut behind me, it didn't echo. It ended, clean, complete. In the days that followed, I blocked her number, deleted every message, locked the locket in a new box. People reached out, some supportive, some demanding an explanation. I didn't give one because I didn't need to defend what I knew was right. The real betrayal wasn't just in what they said about my mom. It was in what they felt entitled to take my story. My silence, my mother's memory, and the locket that wasn't just hers. It was mine to protect. And now, finally, it was back where it belonged. I moved out of the city 2 weeks later, didn't tell many people. Just packed up the apartment, rented a small truck, and drove down to Ashbourne with the windows rolled halfway. It was early fall, leaves starting to curl, gold air just cool enough to need a jacket. I didn't go back to my old house that had been sold years ago, but I found a small place on the edge of town. 1-story, slanted roof, wide porch, a fixer-upper, sure, but I knew how to fix things. I spent the first few days in silence, no music, no news, just the sound of wind in the trees and my own breathing. It was strange at first how empty it all felt, not lonely, just quiet. And then I started rebuilding. I cleaned out the garden, found old tomatoes clinging to their vines, repaired the steps that creaked, repainted the bedroom walls a soft pale green, my mother's favorite. The locket, I kept it in a box on my nightstand. Not hidden, just there, like it always had been, like she never left. Some mornings I'd take it out and just hold it. Not for comfort, not for sadness, but as a reminder of what I stood up for, of what I walked away from. I didn't need closure from Avery or from her parents. I wasn't waiting for apologies. I'd seen who they were when the mask slipped, and I'd seen who I was when I stopped trying to please them. That was enough. People in town started noticing I was back. The woman at the bakery gave me a hug. The man who ran the gas station slipped me a discount and said, "Glad you're home, son." I didn't realize how much I missed being known without having to explain myself. A few months later, I was invited to speak at the local high school, just a small career day thing. I stood in front of a room full of teenagers, talked about home repairs, about building something with your hands, about not being ashamed of work that leaves your palms rough. Afterward, a student came up to me and said, "You seem calm." I smiled. Took me a while to get here, because it had. But the truth is, I was calm, because I had finally made a decision not out of fear, but out of self-respect. I didn't stay in a love that asked me to stay quiet. I didn't marry into a family that asked me to shrink. I chose myself. And it wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was necessary. Sometimes the biggest act of love you can offer the people who raised you is refusing to let the world dishonor their name. And the biggest act of love you can offer yourself is walking away, even when your heart's still halfway in the room. Mom used to say, people don't always see your value right away. That's okay. You weren't born to convince them. I live by that. Now, I build slow, I speak when it matters, and I never ever let someone laugh at the people who made me that locket. I haven't given it to anyone. Maybe one day I will but only when I meet someone who doesn't flinch when it's time to speak up, who doesn't confuse quiet love with weakness, who understands what it means to protect what matters even when no one's watching. Until then, it stays with me, right where it belongs. I used to think strength looked like holding it all together, smiling through it, keeping the peace. Now I know better. Sometimes strength is standing up in the middle of a room where no one else will meet your eyes, and saying enough. Sometimes it's walking away from the wedding you thought you wanted, the life you thought you were building, because the people in the room laughed at your mother like she was a punchline. And the person you loved just sat there and smiled. What they did wasn't a joke, it was a boundary. And that night I learned mine. I don't tell this story for pity or applause. I don't need anyone to call me brave. I just needed to say it out loud, because someone out there might be sitting at a table like I was, heart-pounding, hands shaking, watching people turn pain into entertainment. And if that's you, you don't owe anyone your silence. You don't have to stay just because it's easier than leaving. Sometimes the people who call you too sensitive are just too used to being cruel without consequences. And sometimes the greatest loyalty you can show is to the people who aren't here to defend themselves. So here I am, still standing, still fixing things, just not for people who keep breaking me. Still holding the locket my mother gave me. Still choosing peace, not the kind that requires silence, but the kind that comes from telling the truth and walking away with your head high. What did you think of this story? Have you ever walked out of something you once dreamed of, just to protect your own voice? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose between peace and family, drop a 1 below. You are not alone. And if this story moved you or reminded you of someone you love, subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories for more true stories that speak the quiet truth, one voice at a time. It was a quiet Sunday when I opened the box again, the old wooden one my mother left me. No hinges, no lock, just that faint cedar smell that always reminded me of her coat closet growing up. I sat on the porch, the late autumn sun brushing over my forearms. A crow called out in the distance. Wind rustled through the dry trees, brushing past my screen door like someone polite enough to knock but never enter inside the box. Her photo, her ID badge, a worn recipe card, and the locket. Silver still warm from my hand, I opened it gently like it might shatter. There she was, my grandmother's photo on one side, my mother's on the other, added just months before she passed. 2 women who gave everything they had so I could become who I am. Quiet strength, fierce love. No need for applause. I remembered her voice, soft but certain. One day you'll know who to give it to. I don't know if that day will come. Maybe it will, but today, it stays with me. Because I'm still learning, still becoming, still protecting the parts of me she built. And some legacies aren't meant to be passed on just yet. Some are meant to be held. Close, quiet, unshaken, like her, like this, like me.